I'm going to show you, if I can, um, a brief um, outline of thinking about public procurement and food hubs. I'm going to talk very briefly about the overall context in which this talk is taking place. I'm going to look briefly at what a healthy diet would consist of and how it would change from what we're currently eating. And then to make the case briefly for public procurement of food, a brief description on what food hubs are, and then finally to talk about what's happening in Sheffield, who's involved, and what the plan is in Sheffield. But let me just say that overall, what we're trying to do is to change the way in which we eat and the way in which we produce food in this country. You may or may not be aware that 95% of all the grocery shopping in the UK takes place in supermarkets, in quasi-supermarkets, chains like Spar. Only 5% of our grocery shopping takes place in the places that we love to go shopping for food: farm shops, farmers markets, delis, artisan shops, and those sorts of places. Most farmers, when they were asked about this, said they would prefer to be free from supermarket contracts, which screw them down and give them very little return for their efforts. So part of this discussion tonight is about how to improve the livelihood of small farmers. It's also significant that when you look at the total amount of farmland in the UK, 85% of it is dedicated to animal feed. And as we know, there is a distinct connection between this fact and our dependence on animals and animal feed in the food chain, and our problems with carbon. So to put it in a nutshell, you could say that we have a kind of food which you could call industrial food, and we want to move to a different kind of food system, which I would call sustainable or healthy food. Food which would be good not just for our guts, but also for the planet, and would also give decent returns to producers. And would be, on the whole, sold not through supermarkets and the other multiples, but increasingly through ethical and independent retailers. But that's a long-term view of the kinds of changes we need to bring about. A year or so ago, Henry Dimbleby, who had been commissioned by the government to produce a national food strategy, came up with a series of recommendations for healthy, sustainable food. And in a nutshell, what he proposed was that we needed to eat 30% more fruit and vegetables, 50% more fiber foods, and 25% less high fat, sugar, salt content, or ultra processed foods, and 30% less meat. Currently, ultra-processed food constitutes something like 57% of our diet. And these are foods which we all recognize because they're replete with oil and sugar and starches. They've got lots of salt in. They're the things you find in biscuits and cakes and mass-produced bread. And they're also really the core of the business model of the supermarkets. Without ultra processed food, supermarkets wouldn't make a profit at all. So their profit is the price that's paid for that is by us with a very unhealthy diet in this country, more unhealthy than in most countries apart from the United States. So how do we get out of this system? How do we move from industrial food and agriculture to sustainable, healthy food? Well, one mechanism is by using public procurement. 5.5% of all the food served outside the home in this country is procured by state-funded institutions, schools and hospitals, universities. The NHS food supply chain alone is worth £600 million. So there's a lot of spending power in publicly procured food. And that means that there is a power to shape or reshape the national diet. And that means there's also power to promote alternative sources of supply, to build on the work of small producers, of organic producers. As we've seen, for example, in Nottingham, where the Food for Life Partnership has shifted school meals purchasing to local producers, which has the effect of not just improving the quality of the food offered in schools, but also recirculating money in the local economy. So it's good for the local economy, it's good for the producers, and overall it's good for the planet. Now, food hubs are a very important part of this alternative picture, this also alternative system of food production and distribution, because that's what their function is. They bring food together and they distribute it. Typically, they're managed jointly by the producers and the consumers, often with a public agency like a local authority, acting as a kind of an intermediary or a referee. But public procurement is absolutely critical to their viability. Food hubs, which simply supply individual households and consumers, will never manage to get liftoff, will never manage to have the critical mass which is required for viability. Whereas public procurement, which is worth always millions of pounds, tens of millions of pounds, could be the beginning of a new scaling up system. Food hubs support farmer-friendly supply chains, so they typically support locally, seasonally produced food. In the United States, where I went 2 or 3 years ago, I saw 2 or 3 of them in operation. Overall, there are more than 200 food hubs in the US, and they are a key feature of a growing alternative food economy there. So, getting closer to home, to Sheffield, where I am this evening, the Sheffield Food Partnership is trying to devise a new system of food production and distribution. It's a public-private civil society initiative which is supported by the City Council. It has dozens and dozens of members and supporters. It has a local dairy, very popular in Sheffield, called Our Cow Molly. It has a local cafe chain called Marmaduke's. And it also has, very significantly, the catering contract managers of all the major public agencies in the city. And they are all keen to work together to find a way of moving away from industrial food. So the plan, which we are devising as almost as I speak, is to use the Dimbleby targets as a basis. Those 4 categories, 2 which we're going to increase, fruit and vegetables and fibre, and 2 which we're going to decrease, that's to say the ultra high processed foods and meat. These provide the basis for agreeing a target for each agency in the city and the city as a whole. So we should be able to say in 5 years' time, we have increased, for example, the amount of fruit and vegetables which are being consumed by people who use these agencies by X%. And we've reduced the amount of meat which they're using by Y%. We need, in order to do this, to identify for each agency all the products that fall under each of the 4 categories by value and also by weight and volume. So this is a very detailed piece of work which we are just beginning to embark on. On the other hand, this means that we can begin to identify sources of supply for the additional fruit and vegetables and high fiber foods that we're going to need, preferably local, seasonal, and ethically produced foods. And finally, we're going to need to set up physical hubs with an online ordering system so we can aggregate supply and distribute to the participating agencies. Why is this hub system so important? Well, if you think about it, if we're going to increase the supply, for example, of fruit and vegetables, inevitably we will be drawing on many more sources, not just in Sheffield and South Yorkshire, but from around the country and further afield. And we're going to have packages of fruit and vegetables which need to be aggregated so that they can then be sent on to, for example, the NHS Hospital Trust. Otherwise, we would end up with thousands of tiny deliveries and a massive problem of traceability for each of the agencies taking part in this. So there has to be a place where the stuff can be brought together, it can be monitored, it can be packaged, and it can be sent on. So that's the importance of the physical hubs. And public procurement is absolutely central to this. The question is, of course, is all of this going to help to bring about that massive change in the food system in this country?
Interesting. Thank you very much, Martin. So, a question: how long have you been? How long has this project in Sheffield been going to take you to get to this point?
Well, the food partnership in Sheffield was set up some years ago, but it languished for a long time. But recently, it's been given a boost. In Sheffield, there was an enormous political crisis caused when the council decided to cut down large numbers of trees. And the culmination of that was that the Labour Party's National Executive Committee could see that Labour was in danger of losing control of the council, particularly to the Greens, but also the Lib Dems. So it stepped in after the recent local elections because Sheffield was one of the few places where Labour didn't gain compared with the other parties. It stepped in and it basically sacked the leadership of the Labour group on the council, and a new group was installed, led by a young university lecturer who is committed to a much more open way of working, and above all, of working much more collaboratively with the other two parties. And this has given a boost to all kinds of things in the city, particularly the campaign on climate change. And at the same time, it's given a boost to the food partnership. And last week, we had a meeting which was attended by over 100 people from various organisations to relaunch the food partnership. And there's a great sense of momentum and commitment now. So that's where we are currently. The food partnership consists of a number of working groups, and I'm an advisor to the working group which is on the food industry and on public procurement.
Very interesting. Laura, do you have any comments or questions?
Very interesting talk. I've taken quite a few notes. So at one point you mentioned that in order to make this a really viable project, it has to really focus on public procurement or a larger food redistribution, particularly with food hubs. Could you give an example of like maybe the tonnage that you would see, or is there a way of quantifying like how large the operation would need to be in order to make kind of your system viable?
Well, when I was in the States, I did look in some detail at the food hubs I visited, and I could see, first of all, that yes, the critical mass of business was supplied by public procurement, but the other thing which was clear was that food hubs need a period of growth and consolidation before they become viable and are no longer dependent on public support. And that's probably about 5 years. And I also made an estimate about how much a food hub for a small town would cost to set up. And I mean, if you're interested in the working, I can send you a copy of the report I wrote about all of this. But I did say in my report that there was a need for the government to invest significant sums in helping to set up food hubs. And Henry Dimbleby, in his report on a national food strategy, suggested that there was a need for a national fund of £500 million. Now, not all of that would be for local food hubs. A large proportion of it would be for research into new approaches to agriculture in particular. But some national organisations like the Soil Association have recently argued that there needs to be, I think, a £15 million fund set up to begin to kickstart food hubs. I think we could easily use 15 million in Sheffield alone if we are going to set up the scale of food hubs that I saw in the United States. So it's a big undertaking. And it has to be if we're going to make a big difference, because currently you could say that we are in charge of 5% of the nation's grocery spend, us people who see ourselves as independents and alternatives. And if we're going to make any difference to the other 95%, then we have to do something which frightens the supermarkets into change. And it's got to look as if it has the potential for growth.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm really sorry to both of you. I have to dash now because the start of my practice is about to begin. But thank you so much for the presentation and the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for meeting you.
Thank you, Laura. Okay. Thanks for coming. Enjoy your choir.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, very interesting. I suppose another question, which is for the big institutions, the hospitals, the universities, to commit to using it, they'll need to see sufficient volumes of goods coming to you, which presumably means you've got to convince a significant number of farmers and or other suppliers to drop their contracts with the supermarket and come with you. How's that going to work? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, Bob, you put your finger on the really the most difficult problem apart from finance, because what we have to do is we have to be able to assure the hospital or the university that if they drop supplies from one source, they can rely on a source from another source as completely as they have done in the past. So I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to try out new sourcing for small amounts of products to begin with to see what we can do. But we do have a really big problem in South Yorkshire. South Yorkshire isn't Herefordshire or Lincolnshire. We don't have actually a massive agricultural industry on our doorstep. So we're going to have to pull in supplies from much further afield. And we know that if you just take fruit, if we were to say to a potential fruit farm, we would like to double or treble the amount of fruit you supply, the fruit trees will not produce that fruit in the next month. It will take several years for them to be established. So this is a long-term project as far as fruit is concerned, and it's a long-term project as far as sourcing alternative supplies is concerned, and it will have to be done bit by bit. And we may find ourselves in a situation where we're having to import or to find sources much further afield than we would like. But this exactly is the problem.
Yeah, going to need lots of salespeople, kind of, and contracts people as well.
Yes, it's a very complicated thing, and when you think about this, you think about the very neat sidestepping that the supermarkets have done during the COVID emergency. Within a space of almost weeks, they were able to transfer a large amount of their business up online and also to deliver door to door. And in the case of Tesco, to employ 50,000 people to help them to do this. Now, I'm agnostic about whether we're going to end up with new kinds of retailers or whether what we're going to end up doing is making the existing retailers more, what should I say, more sustainable in the way in which they operate. But it's very hard to see how that can be done because the supermarket's profits, the percentage profit isn't enormous. It's only at scale that Tesco can produce, £2 billion of profit. So if Tesco weren't making money from high ultra processed foods, they would go out of business. The analogy I sometimes think of is between Netflix and the organization which preceded it all over the world, which used to rent out videos. Exactly. Which in a matter of 2 years disappeared from the planet.
Can we get Tesco to disappear?
It would be amazing if that were to happen. So I suspect that what we're going to see is a growth in the alternative sector. People want it. There's a market. People will buy as much good stuff as is produced. That's pretty clear. And on the other hand, I suspect that some supermarkets will find this impossible to do. But it's interesting that the supermarkets have, not all of them, but a number of them, including Tesco, have said to Henry Dimbleby that if the government would introduce firmer rules against processed food, we would go along with those because we know the damage they cause, and we would like to retail better food, but we can't do it alone.
Okay, well, look, I'm sure we could go on and on and on, but let's stop now and go and sit in the garden for